Module 12, Labor Markets. In a market economy like the U.S., income comes from ownership of the means of production, resources, or assets. One's income is a function of two things: the quantity of each resource one owns, the value society places on those resources. For the majority of us, the most important resource we own is our labor. What is the labor markets? The labor market is the term that economists use for all the different markets for labor. There's a different market for every different type of labor, depending on work, skill level, geographic location. The labor market is influenced by supply and demand. If a firm wants to maximize profits, it will pay more for a worker than the value of his or her marginal productivity to the firm. This is called the first rule of labor markets. If marginal product is the additional output a firm can produce by adding one more worker to the marginal product process, marginal product depends on the capital and technology which workers have to work. Demand for labor equals the marginal product of labor times the price of output. That equals the value of the marginal product of labor. And it is the marginal product of an additional worker multiplied by the price of the firm's output. Demand for labor in a perfectly competitive output market. The question for any firm is how much labor to hire. A perfectly competitive labor market is one where firms can hire all the labor they wish at the going market wage. Employers who need secretaries can probably hire as many as they need if they pay the going wage rate. Graphically, this means the firms face a horizontal supply curve of labor. Demand for labor in imperfectly competitive output markets. If an employer does not sell its output in a perfectly competitive industry, it faces a downward sloping demand curve for output. In order to sell additional output, the firm must lower its price. This is true if the firm is a monopoly, but it is also true if the firm is an oligopoly or monopolistically competitive. This means that a worker's marginal product is valued by the marginal revenue, not the price. The demand for labor is the marginal product times the marginal revenue, which we call marginal revenue product. So the demand for labor is marginal product of labor times marginal revenue, and that equals marginal revenue product. What determines the going rate? The going wage rate. The labor market has demand and supply curves like other markets. The demand for labor is a downward sloping function of the wage rate. Remember, this is coming from firms demanding laborers. The market demand for labor is the horizontal sum of all firms' demand for labor. The supply for labor is a curve that's upward sloping, and it's a function of the wage rate. Remember, that is coming from workers offering their labor. Between workers and employers. To give workers more power, the U.S. government has passed a number of laws to create a more equal balance of power between workers and employers. The laws include the following: setting a minimum hourly wage, setting maximum hours of work, prohibiting child labor, regulating health and safety conditions in the workplace, preventing discrimination on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and age, requiring employers to provide family leave, requiring employers to give advance notice of layoffs, covering workers with unemployment insurance, setting the limit on the number of immigrant workers. Prominent U.S. workplace protection laws. Social Security Act of 1935 establishes unemployment insurance. Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 establishes a minimum wage, limits child labor, and has rules requiring payment of overtime pay for those in jobs that are paid by the hour and exceed 40 hours. Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII of the Act prohibits discrimination in employment based on race, gender, national origin, religion, or sexual orientation. Occupational Health and Safety Act of 1970 creates the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which protects workers from physical harm in the workplace. Employee Retirement and Income Security Act of 1974 regulates employee pension rules and benefits. Continuing along, Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 prohibits discrimination against women in the workplace who are planning to get pregnant or who are returning to work after pregnancy. Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 prohibits discrimination against those with disabilities and requires reasonable accommodations. Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993 allows employees to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave per year for family reasons, including birth and family illness. Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 restores protection for pay discrimination claims on the basis of sex, race, national origin, age, religion, or disability. Labor market power by employers. A competitive labor market is one where there are many potential employers for a given type of worker, say a secretary or an accountant. If there was only one employer in a labor market, that employer has no direct competition in hiring. If they offer lower wages than would exist in a competitive market, employees would have few options. Since the employer is exploiting its market power, we call the firm a monopsony. However, because they face the market supply curve for labor, if they want to hire more workers, they must raise the wage they pay. This creates a quandary, which we can understand by introducing a new concept, the marginal cost of labor. The marginal cost of labor is the cost to the firm of hiring one more worker. Continuing along, a labor union seeks to change the balance of power between employers and workers by requiring employers to deal with workers collectively. A labor union operates like a monopoly in a labor market, collective bargaining, negotiations between unions and firms. The subject of labor unions can be controversial. Supporters of labor unions view them as the workers' primary line of defense against efforts by profit-seeking firms to hold down wages and benefits. Critics of labor unions view them as having a tendency to grab as much as they can in the short term. Facts about union membership and pay. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, about 10.7% of all U.S. workers belong to unions, 11.2% of U.S. male workers belong to unions, 10.2% of female workers do, 10.5% of white workers, 13% of black workers, and 8.8% of Hispanic workers belong to unions. 11.8% of full-time workers and 5.7% of part-time workers are union members. 5.11% of workers ages 16 to 24 belong to union, as do 13.9% of workers ages 45 to 54. Some of the largest American unions are National Education Association, Service Employees International Union, American Federation of Teachers. Higher wages for union workers. Because a union is the sole supplier of labor, it can act like a monopoly and ask for whatever wage rate it can obtain from its workers. For its workers. If employers need workers, they have to meet the union's wage demand. This labor market situation resembles what a monopoly firm does in selling a product, but in this case a union is a monopoly selling labor to firms. Continuing along, from the union point of view, workers who receive higher wages are better off. A sensible union must recognize that when it pushes up the wage, it also reduces the firm's incentive to hire. From the firm's point of view, the key question is whether union workers' higher wages are matched by higher productivity. If so, then the firm can afford to pay the higher union wages, and the demand curve for unionized labor could actually shift to the right. Union workers might have higher productivity than non-union workers because higher wages may elicit higher productivity. Union workers tend to stay longer at given jobs. It reduces the employer's cost for training and hiring. The decline in union membership in the U.S. The proportion of U.S. workers belonging to unions has declined dramatically since the early 1950s. Economists have offered a number of possible explanations: the shift from manufacturing to service industries, the forced globalization and increased competition from foreign producers, a reduced desire for unions because of the workplace protection laws now in place, U.S. legal environment that makes it relatively more difficult for unions to organize workers and expand their membership. Employment discrimination. Discrimination involves acting on the belief that members of a certain group are inferior solely because of a factor such as race, gender, or religion. There are many types of discrimination, but the focus here will be on discrimination in labor markets. This arises if workers with the same skill levels as measured by education, experience, and expertise receive different pay because they have different job opportunities or because of their race or gender. Earnings gaps by race and gender. A possible signal of labor market discrimination is when an employer pays one group less than another. Research by the economists Francine Blau and Lawrence Kahn shows that the gap between the earnings of men and women did not move much in the 1970s, but has declined since the 1980s. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the gap between the earnings of black and whites diminished in the 1970s, but has not changed in 50 years. Competitive markets and discrimination. In a competitive market, if the business owners care more about the color of money than they care about the color of skin, they will have an incentive to make buying, selling, hiring, and promotion decisions strictly based on economic factors. Discriminatory impulses can emerge at a number of levels, among managers, among workers, among customers. If the business owners care more about the color of money than they will have an incentive. If business is located in an area with a large minority population and refuses to sell to minorities, it will cut into its own profits. If some businesses run by bigoted employers refuse to pay women and/or minorities a wage based on their productivity, then other profit-seeking employers can hire these workers. And here is a graph that shows the differences in terms of from 2012 and predicting out to 2060 what percent of the total U.S. population each one of these races is. Immigration. A surge of immigration can affect the economy in a number of different ways. About 1/3 of immigrants over the age of 25 lack a high school diploma. As a result, many of the recent immigrants end up in jobs like restaurant and hotel work, lawn care, and janitorial work. This kind of immigration represents a shift to the right in the supply of unskilled labor for a number of jobs, which will lead to lower wages for these jobs. The middle and upper income households that purchase the services of these unskilled workers will benefit from these lower wages. However, low-skilled U.S. workers who must compete with low-skilled immigrants for jobs will tend to suffer. Quick review. What are labor markets? Why is the value of marginal product of labor the demand of labor? What is the demand for labor in perfectly competitive output markets? How do you graph it? What is the demand for labor in imperfectly competitive output markets? How do you graph it? How does supply and demand interact to determine the market wage rate? How are wages and employment determined in labor markets where employers have market power, monopsonies? What is the role and impact of labor unions? How does the existence of a labor union affect wages and employment in a labor market? What are the earnings gaps based on race and gender? What is the impact of discrimination in a competitive market? And what are the economic implications of immigration? And that is all.